Hello and welcome to our Syxsense January Patch Tuesday webinar. Today, we have our industry expert, Rob Brown, here to give us an inside look into the newest Patch Tuesday release. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat and Rob will reach out after that.
Thank you very much, Johanna, and a very warm welcome to everybody on the first of our Patch Tuesday webcast series for 2024. It is January, it is super cold, it is beautiful here in the UK, and we do have a lot to talk about over the next 30 minutes. Starting off with some news. Now, this has been coming to you quite slowly throughout the last several months as we've been providing more details with regards to end of life for the operating systems. We just want to provide some clarity on what is actually happening over the next couple of years with regards to the Microsoft operating system. So Windows Server 2008 was end of life many years ago, but they had provided some ESU support, which is extended servicing update support, which you had to pay for, and they provided a number of additional years of patch content. That has now come to an end. There is no longer after this month any more updates for 2008 or 2008 R2. We have the start or the ESU year one support for 2012. So 2012 is end of life, but if you have a license for ESU, you can extend 2012 support for another couple of years. That actually runs out in October 2026. Windows 10, which is super surprising, is end of life in October 2025. Now that's actually just about a year and 3/4 away. So if you're not already moving to Windows 11, you really ought to consider the migration from Windows 10 to Windows 11. If you haven't already watched the December Patch Tuesday webinar, I did actually cover some of the fundamental differences that had come in that patch sequence to help customers who had gone to Windows 11 configure their operating system to be more like Windows 10. Windows 10 has been around for a long time. It's a very stable operating system. I know it's much enjoyed amongst a lot of the IT around the globe. Windows 11 brought a new interface, a new UI, and it confused a lot of staff. So the last set of updates we had for Windows 11 allowed you to configure the menu along the bottom so it could look more like Windows 10, and that may help in the faster adoption of Windows 11. But please do plan that, especially some of our larger organizations who maybe are in healthcare or retail, where that's just naturally slower in order to migrate, then plans should already be made. Windows 11 23H2, which came out end of last year, has support till November 2026. It's very good that Microsoft are extending the lifespan of the feature updates for those two operating systems, and now you get 30 whole months between feature update support, and that will allow you to continue to patch Windows 11 on 23H2 all the way to 2026. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Windows 11 end of life, official end of life, is 2031. So you do have a long time before you need to plan for Windows 12. Excuse me. Everything I just mentioned there does not include the long-term servicing. So if you do have a special operating system with a special license for Windows 10 and Windows 11, you can actually have a lot more years support for patching if you do have that long-term servicing. Now, something that should concern a lot of us is the fact that we didn't have any more preview updates. We haven't had any since November. And this doesn't sound like an issue. And as we go through the month, if we don't get preview updates, then Microsoft is not exposing the patches to a lot of their partners, a lot of their customers who do in fact test preview updates. Now, although preview updates are not supported by Microsoft, especially here at Syxsense, we like to test those preview updates to see what kind of impact negatively those updates could have on an operating system. Allows us to see if there's any kind of blue screens or any kind of errors that are generated by those updates. Allows us to prepare. Now, if you don't have that exposure to those millions and millions of customers who do take part in the preview update, it means that Microsoft is relying on the internal testing teams that Microsoft have to perform all that testing for you. And potentially they don't have all of the environments and languages that that they would traditionally have with the preview updates scheme. What does this mean? Well, it means that we need to do a bit more testing. For the second month in a row, we do not have preview updates, which means anything that's coming in February potentially would not have had such a robust set of tests. As we didn't have for December, your January updates should be tested and double tested across a whole section of your environment that has the same configuration as the majority of your devices. So some friendly IT users should be targeted, but also an extended pilot potentially should be used as well, just to make sure that all of the different hardware configurations you have are in fact tested before you do a wider rollout. We also had some 0 days. So just before Christmas, of course it happens. We had a Google update, and I know a lot of our managed services customers actually requested that we didn't deploy this, quite rightly so. It's right near the holidays, but that update is quite serious. It was an update for Google Chrome that was weaponized. That's CVE 2023-7024, and that impacted an open source WebRTC component and heap buffer overflow. And lastly, you may have seen some news about Terrapin SSH. Now, this is a particular vulnerability that's impacting not necessarily the Microsoft operating system, but more applications that run on the operating system, all the third-party apps. Now, if you haven't already done so, there is a dedicated third-party webinar that we host here at Syxsense every month. It's towards the end of the month, actually. I'll actually show you where you can find the link to subscribe to that. And we'll cover all of the third-party applications, but this one in particular is of interest. Now, Terrapin, I've done some research on this. Terrapin allows attackers to alter or corrupt information transmitted in the SSH data stream during the handshake, which is the earliest connection stage when two parties negotiate together to establish a secure connection. So it's serious. Now, as such, Terrapin represents the first practical cryptographic attack targeting the integrity of the SSH protocol itself. Now, there is a list of third-party applications that are impacted. We're still gathering that list. It will probably be uploaded to the Syxsense website very soon. We have already updated third parties that we know are impacted, such as Putty. So if you are in a hybrid environment where Windows and Linux is used, potentially Putty is an application that you may have installed that has a new version that will solve the vulnerability in that version. So, but please keep an eye on that. And if you do have any third parties that maybe you'd like some assistance with, please let us know. Use the chat function or send us an email directly. Now, we also follow advice from CISA. So CISA is the cybersecurity advisories for cybersecurity infrastructure security agency. Now, they have put out a release of Mozilla. to suggest that Firefox 114 and 102.1.2 have been updated. An attacker could exploit these vulnerabilities to take control of the system, and they encourage you to follow the release notes and to use their recommended deployment plan to protect your environment. I don't think that has anything to do with the previous vulnerability I mentioned for Terrapin, but nonetheless, I would highly recommend that Mozilla, if you're using it in your environment, along with Google and Edge, be deployed if the severity is critical or high. Now, Microsoft gave us a second month of an extremely small number of fixes. Potentially, this has got something to do with the preview updates. Potentially not. Maybe it's the fact that Windows 10 and Windows 11 have much fewer supported feature updates. That's probably more likely. However, that doesn't mean that you can enjoy a month off. There are still an awful lot of high risk vulnerabilities that we're going to talk about today. So they did release 48 fixes. Only 2 were critical. So it's a very small number, but do keep that into your mind. This is because there's some actually that are not critical, according to Microsoft, which we think are extremely important. 9 of those are more likely to be weaponized. However, none are. So although Microsoft is saying that 9 could more likely become weaponized, there isn't any that we are aware of, or Microsoft, or any of our partners, that would suggest that any of the vulnerabilities fixed in this Patch Tuesday release, in fact, are used in an active exploit. We will, however, be able to track that on a daily basis and update Syxsense with any vulnerabilities that have been weaponized since. 0 are public aware, which is great, and we're going to cover what weaponized and public aware is, what it means to us in just a few minutes. We do have 4 jump points. Now, to put that into perspective, you might say 48 fixes, 1/5 of those are more likely to be weaponized, and 1/8 of those have a jump point. Now, a jump point is considered to us as a high-risk vulnerability. In the CVSS, which we're going to talk about again in a moment, it's called a scope. Now, the scope is where you can actively exploit one particular technology within the operating system and then move sideways. So in the example of a hypervisor, you may be able to attack the host and jump into the guest, or vice versa. So that's the kind of sideways risk that you have. It's been seen already last year with several highly exposed weaponized threats. We might be familiar with other vulnerabilities where they came in through one vulnerability and then moved sideways, such as the SolarWinds. So we do like to keep an eye on those jump points, and all of that data is published to the website. We'll take a look at that in a second. Now we have a new winner. So we like to record these because the different types of fixes in these updates can determine an additional level of risk that we want to know about what exactly is being fixed and how important or urgent it is to roll out those updates. So this month we had 11 remote code execution vulnerabilities, and these are some of the worst ones. These are the kind of cyber attacks. So that's where you remotely execute commands to place malware or other malicious code on the computer or network. Those are some of the most serious. Actually, last month this was number 2. It's gone back to number 1. Information disclosure, that's when a program unintentionally reveals sensitive information. That's very serious. If it was a password or a username or something like that, you also had that tied for first place with 11 fixes. Elevation of privilege, that's where a threat actor gains access to an employee's account, can bypass the proper authorization channel, and successfully grants themselves access to data they're not supposed to have. That came in third with 10. Security feature bypass, that's when an attacker bypasses the authentication mechanisms of a device to gain unauthorized access. We had 7 of those, followed by denial of service. That's simply meant to shut down the device or to make it inaccessible. We had 6 fixes, and finally we had 3 spoofing vulnerabilities. That's an act of disguising a communication or identity. So just to recap, remote code execution is back on top with 11 fixes, and they're some of the most serious. So any vulnerability that you see with a remote code execution vulnerability in the title, you should pay particular attention, as that is used in a cyber attack. Now, how else are you going to prioritize? So we could say critical and high only. Well, at Syxsense, we like to give you options. And we actually have 6. So this is what we call our Syx score, which is made up of the vendor severity, which ranges from critical, high, medium, low, and NA, obviously from most serious to the least serious. But we also combine that with the CVSS score. Now, the CVSS score is an industry recognized calculator. Currently, it's version 4.1, and it uses a whole multitude of calculations to determine a severity of a vulnerability from 10 to 0. So anything that is super critical is given a 10, and anything that is NA or bug fix or something like that is given a CVSS score of 0. Depending on how complex the attack has to be, or how much level of physical access to the network or device, can change the score completely. And actually, as we find, when you compare the vendor severity and the CVSS score together, you get a really good sort of transparent idea about where you should be focusing your priorities. A lot of vendor severities are not critical. The CVSS score would say otherwise. Sometimes the CVSS score is less critical. The vendor severity would say otherwise. If you compare the two and use both sets of data, you're able to actually justify the selection of including the updates that would make the risk too great for your organization. So we like to combine those together. Next, we've got the state of the vulnerability. So we talked about this earlier, weaponized and public aware. So when something is actively being used in an exploit, we call that weaponized. So we find out through our antivirus partners and Microsoft if a particular vulnerability is used in a ransomware attack or an email campaign to exploit viruses. We actually do see that coming through. Now, if something is weaponized, even if it wasn't critical or high or medium severity, if it was being weaponized, would you want to take the risk and not deploy that to keep your environment safe? We'll leave that to you. Next, we've got public aware. Public aware does not mean that the industry knows about the vulnerability. Public aware means the exact, precise method to expose that vulnerability is somewhere on the internet, often via bug bounty programs or white hat hackers. They put some fantastic data together on YouTube that will show you exactly how you can exploit a particular vulnerability. Doesn't always mean it will be weaponized, but again, it's additional state level data that helps you make the right decision about the patches you are deploying to your environment, especially if some of your environments are very distributed. If you have a rather large worldwide distributed workforce, maybe you can't deploy everything. Maybe you have to deploy it in bands. So you may decide to do the most serious band first, get those updates out very quickly, and then spend the next week doing everything else, which is not as serious, but maybe public aware. Now, to balance, we have a countermeasure. So countermeasures come in 2 types. The first one is a mitigation. So you may have a sophisticated antivirus that is protecting your environment, and in that case, you may not need to deploy it at all. You also have a workaround, and that's another countermeasure. So you may be able to change a registry key, change a permission, or set something in group policy that effectively protects your environment. You can choose to deploy these countermeasures in order to protect your environment much, much quicker, especially if some of those updates are very, very large. Some of these cumulative updates or 1.5 gigabytes, and it's simply not possible to deploy that to all corners of your organization. So you may deploy the countermeasures that will allow you time to deploy the patch to keep your environment safe. And lastly, your exposure. Of course, if your environment is up to date and you have suddenly this update that is critical and weaponized on only 1 or 2 of your machines, you may not prioritize that as much as something that maybe was less severe, but also weaponized on 95% of your estate. So you can choose to use all of the 6 elements to make the correct decision when it comes to which patches you prioritize based on all of those factors. Now, if you're not a Syxsense customer, it doesn't matter. We'll actually show you how to prioritize them on our website, which is exactly where we're going to go right now. So on the Syxsense website, if you pop over to syxsense.com, you'll find our homepage. On our homepage, you can find out everything there is to know about Syxsense, including if you want to use the chat function in the corner. We actually enjoy sending over our white papers for patch testing or any kind of rollout strategy, methodologies, best practices, things like that. If you use the resources section, you'll find all the resources that we upload, including this Patch Tuesday webinar, but also the third-party updates that we are going to that we're going to schedule for the rest of the month, and all the articles that we publish, especially the GigaOM Radar report. We're really happy to be right in the middle of that as an outperformer. If you click this link here, you'll find the Patch Tuesday write-up, which you can also subscribe to receive an email every single month. In addition to this Patch Tuesday webinar, you'll be able to do the read-up on Patch Tuesday itself, which we're going to talk about now. Now, we did have 2 updates that had a CVSS score of 9.0 or above. One of those was critical, one of them was actually not critical, which is why we like to combine the 2. If I counted all the CVSS together, we had a total of 315.8, which was twice as many as we had last month, although we had half the number of updates, which is kind of interesting. But the average number of CVSSs in this release was 7. Last month it was 7.2. So it just gives us a release, and I certainly wouldn't recommend anyone skipping the January release. In here we had 3 highlightable vulnerabilities I'm going to talk about, starting with this one. Now, if you're not a Syxsense customer, it doesn't matter. We're going to give you the CVE references in a table just below where you can take the CVE, pop it into your tool set, and it will tell you how much of your environment is impacted. Just take some notes and start deploying the higher exposed ones from top to bottom. Starting with 2024-0057. Now, this is a .NET Framework and Visual Studio security feature bypass. Now, an attacker could exploit this by creating a specially crafted X.509 certificate that it intentionally introduces a chain building failure. And this has the highest CVSS score of all updates. It was only ranked by Microsoft as important, and it has a CVSS score of 9.1. The risk for this one is the attack vector is network. Now, this means any network, including the internet, can be used to infiltrate this particular vulnerability. It has low attack complexity and no privileges required and no user interaction. So kind of like the keys there is that any network, low attack complexity, no privileges, no interaction, is why this has got such a high CVSS score. Luckily for us, it doesn't have a jump point, which means you can't move sideways. The second vulnerability is CVE 20674. This is a Windows Kerberos security feature bypass vulnerability. Now, an unauthenticated attacker could exploit this vulnerability by establishing a machine in the middle, MITM. This is quite new. We've heard before about man in the middle. This is a machine in the middle attack. Or other local spoofing techniques, then sending a malicious Kerberos message to the client victim machine to spoof itself as the Kerberos authentication server. This is another feature bypass vulnerability. This is exploitation more likely, and it is one of the critical vulnerabilities that Microsoft has produced a fix for this month. It has the second highest CVSS score at 9.0. Now, its attack risk is slightly less severe. It has an attack vector of adjacent, which means you have to be at least on the network of the device. But it does have low attack complexity, low privileges, no user interaction, and it does include a jump point. Now, what this means is that once you can attack that Kerberos, you can do what you want with it to potentially attack other parts of the operating system. It's extremely important to prioritize that one. And lastly, CVE 2024-0056. This is a SQL client, SQL data provider security feature bypass vulnerability. And that's also another attack with the machine in the middle, used to decrypt and read or modify TLS traffic between the client and the server. This vulnerability does have another jump point. However, its vendor severity is important. Its CVSS is 8.7. That's just 0.3 away from it being critical. Its attack vector is network. Its attack complexity is high. No privileges. It doesn't require any user interaction at all. And as I mentioned, it does in fact have a jump point. Extremely serious. Now, down here, we have all of the vulnerabilities that were fixed by Microsoft, including the reference, any additional details. So anything of interest that would help you to prioritize one update over another. We can appreciate that a lot of vendor severity and CVSS scores can be the same. The difference is the exposure and those additional details to help you make the right decision. Just pop that CVE reference into your toolset and begin to deploy them in a phased way. If you are choosing severity, do anything that's critical or high or weaponized in its first run, and then start going downwards. All of the vulnerabilities, as I mentioned, have been included here. Just one thing I want to mention, there is one particular vulnerability down here that is also important to note, which is this critical one. Now, this critical one is all the way down here with a CVSS of 7.5, but it is a Hyper-V remote code execution vulnerability. It does have exploitation less likely. However, I would recommend that you deploy that to your environment just to keep your environment safe. Thank you very much for joining us today. If there is anything we could do to help, please use the chat function to ask any questions. We will reply privately to all requests. If you would like to see more of Syxsense, you can use the button in the corner there to book a demo. And until February, I wish you the very best. And until then, happy patching.